September 1900. On a low, narrow island off the coast of Texas, the city of Galveston had never felt more alive. Along the shoreline, families walked in the warm evening air. Children played at the edge of the waves. The streetcars ran through the streets. The wharves were crowded with ships, and the grand hotels were nearly full. This was the richest city in Texas, a booming port at the very height of its golden age. Out over the Gulf, a few clouds were beginning to gather. But on this coast, at the end of summer, that was nothing unusual. For most people, it was an ordinary evening at the end of an ordinary season. But no one walking those streets that night knew what was coming. They did not know that within a single day, this city would be gone. They did not know that the sea they had lived beside their whole lives was about to rise up in the dark and swallow it whole. And they did not know that this was about to become the deadliest natural disaster in the history of the United States. A single night that would take more lives than any storm before it, or any storm since. This is the story of the Galveston Hurricane of 1900. To understand what happened here, you really only need to understand one thing about Galveston. It was almost completely defenseless. The city sat on a flat barrier island, a thin strip of sand where the very highest point rose less than 9 feet above the level of the sea. There was no seawall. There was nothing standing between the city and the open ocean but a gentle slope of beach. Some people had warned that this was dangerous. Some had called for a great seawall to be built. But the city's own chief weather forecaster, a respected scientist named Cline, had dismissed the idea in the local newspaper, calling the very notion that a hurricane could ever seriously harm Galveston an absurd delusion. And so no wall was ever built. Worse still, the natural sand dunes along the shore were dug away to make room for new building, stripping the island of the last thin barrier it had. Galveston believed it was safe, and far out in the ocean, something was already moving toward it that would prove exactly how wrong that belief had been. Far out in the tropical Atlantic, in the last days of August, a storm was born. At first, it was nothing unusual. It drifted slowly west, and in early September, it passed over the island of Cuba as little more than a heavy tropical storm. And it was here, over Cuba, that the first chance to save Galveston was lost. The forecasters in Cuba knew these waters better than anyone on Earth. They had studied hurricanes for generations, and watching the sky and the clouds and the falling pressure, they became convinced that this storm was turning dangerous, and that it was not heading harmlessly out to sea, but into the warm open water of the Gulf of Mexico, straight toward Texas. They tried to send that warning north. But the Weather Service in the United States would not listen. Its director in Washington was a proud man who believed American forecasters knew far better than the Cubans, and he had ordered that no weather reports out of Cuba were to be trusted or passed along. He was so certain this storm posed no real danger that he forbade his own people from even using the word hurricane without his permission. Washington had already decided the storm would curve north, brush past Florida, and travel harmlessly up the Atlantic coast. So that is where the warnings were sent. Almost nothing went to Texas. The one group of people who had seen the truth had already been silenced. And the storm did exactly what the Cubans had feared. It slid into the Gulf of Mexico. And there, over water still warm from the long summer, it began to grow into a monster. The morning of September the 8th came grey and heavy over Galveston. But it was not frightening. A long, slow swell had begun rolling in from the Gulf, larger than usual, breaking strangely against the sand. And here lies the cruel part of this story. To most people in the city, it looked like nothing more than the approach of a rainstorm. In fact, the unusual waves actually drew a crowd. Families came down to the beach to watch them roll in, great walls of surf crashing against the shore. Children played at the water's edge. None of them understood that those swells were the first breath of something enormous, still far out at sea. What none of them could see was that the real danger was not the rain, and not even the wind. It was the water that the storm was pushing ahead of it. Far out in the Gulf, the hurricane was driving a vast mound of seawater toward the low island, a surge that would not arrive as a slowly rising flood, but as a wall. And nothing on that flat strip of sand stood more than 9 feet above the sea. One man, at least, began to sense it. Watching the tide climb higher than it should, and rising against the wind, the city's forecaster grew deeply uneasy. He knew that only something vast, far out in the Gulf, could push the sea ahead of it like that. Storm flags were raised over the city, and word began to spread for the people in the lowest areas to move to higher ground. But it came late, and it did not travel far. The weather had been fine for days. The city was full of summer visitors, and these were people who had been told for years that no storm could ever truly harm them. Why leave now, over a little wind and rain? So they stayed. They stayed in their homes. They stayed in the hotels. They stayed on the island. Some heeded the warning, but most did not. By early afternoon, the wind had begun to howl, and the rain was driving in sideways. And then something new began. Water. It came creeping up from the gulf on one side of the island, and up from the bay on the other, rising into the streets. First it reached the ankles of those still outside, then their knees. Families stood on their porches and watched the sea climb their front steps, and slowly the calm began to turn into fear. From the higher ground, people could see it now. The gulf and the bay were reaching across the island toward each other, and soon they would meet. By late afternoon, they did. The two seas joined together in the middle of the city, and the whole island vanished under a single sheet of water. There was no longer any high ground anywhere. There was nowhere left to run. Anyone still trying to reach safety was now wading through waist-deep water in a screaming wind, in a city that had already become part of the sea. Inside their homes, families fled upward, from the ground floor to the upper rooms, then into the attics, and finally out onto the roofs, as the water rose room by room beneath them. Some would cling to those rooftops all night long. Others would feel the whole house lift and shudder and break apart around them. And still, the very worst had not come. Out in the Gulf, the storm was still building, still turning, still driving toward the shore. The bridges to the mainland had been swept away. The telegraph wires were going down, one by one. The last trains could not get through. Nearly 40,000 people were trapped on a sinking island, cut off from the rest of the world. And the sea was still rising. By 6 o'clock that evening, the wind was screaming past 100 miles an hour. At the weather office, the instruments recorded the gusts climbing higher and higher, until the wind gauge itself was torn from the roof and hurled away into the dark. After that, no one could measure the storm. They could only try to survive it. At its peak, the hurricane came ashore as a Category 4 monster, with winds estimated at around 140 miles an hour. And then came the sea. A storm surge, a wall of water driven ahead of the hurricane, rose up out of the Gulf and struck the shore at around 7:30 that night. It rose more than 15 feet. Remember, the highest point on the entire island stood less than 9 feet above the water. In some places, the sea is said to have risen several feet in a matter of seconds. In minutes, the whole city disappeared beneath the flood. Every street, every home, the entire island, gone under the black water in the dark. And the surge did not come alone. As it swept across the island, it tore houses from their foundations and drove them into the houses behind them. And as those houses collapsed, their wreckage joined the flood, until a wall of shattered timber and brick was moving through the city like a giant battering ram, miles wide, grinding everything in its path to pieces. Whole neighborhoods were swept away in moments. The homes of the poor, built of wood, simply came apart. Thousands of people were thrown into the raging water in the dark, among the nails and the broken glass and the wreckage of everything they had ever owned. The flimsy wooden houses of the working families went first, and most of those who lived through the night were the ones lucky enough to be inside the few strong buildings of brick and stone. For miles, in the black water, the sea was full of people clinging to anything that would float, praying only to last until the morning. To understand what that night was truly like, consider the man who had said it could never happen. The city's forecaster had stayed in his own home, a strong, well-built house, and around 50 of his neighbors had crowded inside with him, believing it would keep them safe. For hours they waited in the dark as the water climbed the walls. And then, at around 8:30, a huge section of railway trestle, torn loose by the flood and driven by the waves, smashed into the house. The building lurched off its foundation and began to break apart, throwing everyone inside into the sea. Of the roughly 50 people who had sheltered there, all but 18 were killed within moments. Among the dead was the forecaster's own wife, who was expecting their 4th child. She went under the water, and she never came back up. He himself was nearly drowned. He was knocked unconscious, and then came to, crushed against floating wreckage, still somehow clutching his youngest daughter. His brother found him a few minutes later with the 2 older girls. And for the next 3 hours, in total darkness, this one family drifted through the drowned city on a raft of broken debris. They climbed from one sinking piece of wreckage to another, as each began to give way beneath them. They turned their backs to the wind and held planks behind them to shield the children from the timber flying through the air. All around them in the dark, they could hear houses collapsing and the screams of the dying, and they could do nothing at all. When the water finally set them down, they were only 300 yards from where their home had stood. Thousands of people spent that night in exactly this way, clinging to the wreckage of their own city in the dark. Many of them did not live to see the morning. The storm raged on for hours in the blackness. There was no rescue that could reach them, and no shelter left to run to. There was only the water, and the wind, and the flying wreckage, and the desperate work of holding on, until the sea, at last, began to fall. And right on the very edge of that shore stood an orphanage, where 10 nuns cared for 93 children. As the water rose, the sisters gathered every single child into the strongest building they had, and to keep them calm, they sang an old hymn that sailors sing in storms. But the water kept climbing. When the first building collapsed and washed away into the dark, the sisters understood what was coming. Desperate to keep the children from being torn away from them, each nun took a length of clothesline and tied 6 to 8 children to her own body, so that whatever happened, they would not be separated. It was an act of pure love. And when the last building finally gave way, that same rope became a trap. All 10 of the sisters and 90 of the children drowned together in the dark. Only 3 of them survived, 3 boys who were swept out of the wreckage and into a tree, where they clung to the branches, floating through the storm for more than a day before they were found alive, far out at sea. When the bodies were found later, many of the children were still tied to the sisters who had died trying to save them. The water finally began to fall near midnight, and when the survivors climbed down from the wreckage at first light the next morning, September the 9th, they looked out on a world that no longer made any sense. Where a great city had stood the day before, there was now a plain of splintered wreckage stretching all the way to the sea. More than half the buildings in Galveston were simply gone. Around 3,600 homes had been completely destroyed, and there was not a single building left on the island that had escaped damage at all. About 10,000 people, out of a city of 38,000, no longer had a home to return to. The grand houses were reduced to bare foundations. The busy wharves were splinters, and curving across the ruined city ran an enormous wall of debris, in places 30 feet high and 3 miles long, built from shattered houses, broken furniture, dead animals, and the bodies of the dead. Because there were bodies everywhere, tangled in the wreckage, buried beneath the ruins, floating in the standing water. Survivors moved through the debris calling out the names of their husbands, their wives, their children, and heard nothing in return. Whole families had disappeared in a single night. Many people would never even learn what had become of the ones they loved. Some found their families alive among the crowds of survivors and wept with relief. Many more searched for days and found only silence, or found the ones they loved among the dead. Countless children were left orphaned. In a single night, the storm had reached into almost every family on the island. No one will ever know exactly how many died. The official count is around 8,000. Some believe the true number reached 12,000. Either way, more people died in Galveston that night than in any other natural disaster in the history of the United States, before or since. As the survivors dug through the great mounds of debris in the days that followed, they found hundreds more bodies, many so battered by the storm that they could only be known by a pocket watch or a wedding ring. The heat that followed made the air almost impossible to breathe, thick with smoke and lime and the smell of the dead. In all, the storm had done around $20 million of damage, an enormous fortune for the time, to a city that only a day before had been one of the wealthiest in the country. And then came the grim work of the living, and it was almost beyond imagining. There were so many bodies, in the heat of a Texas September, that they could not be buried. The waterlogged ground would not allow it. At first, the authorities loaded the dead onto a barge, hundreds at a time, carried them far out into the Gulf, and dropped them into the sea. But the sea would not keep them. Within days, the bodies began washing back onto the beaches. In the end, there was only one terrible choice left. The dead had to be burned. Great funeral fires were lit among the ruins, and they burned, day and night, for weeks, and the smoke and the smell hung over the city and never lifted. The men who did this work, gangs of them, many of them black, were often forced to it at gunpoint by the militia, and given whiskey to help them endure a task that no human being should ever have to do. The city was placed under martial law. Soldiers patrolled the streets with rifles. And in those first lawless days, looters crept through the ruins, robbing the dead, even cutting the rings from the fingers of the drowned. Under martial law, men caught doing this were shot where they stood. Galveston, one of the proudest cities in all of America, had become something closer to a battlefield. For a full day, the city was completely alone. Every telegraph line was down. Every bridge to the mainland had been washed away. The rest of the country still had no idea that one of its great cities had just been wiped off the map. Finally, a small group of survivors managed to cross the storm-wrecked bay in a boat and carry the first word to the mainland. And when that message reached the outside world, at first, no one believed it. Surely, they thought, no storm on earth could do such a thing. But slowly, the truth reached the nation, and help began to move toward the island. Relief poured in from across the country, trains loaded with food and water and tents and medicine, and money began arriving at the shattered coast. Donations came from the richest men in America, and among those who came in person was the aging founder of the American Red Cross, by then almost 80 years old, who traveled to Galveston to lead the relief effort in what would turn out to be the last great mission of her long life. She and her workers set up in the ruined city, took in the children the storm had left orphaned, and helped a broken people find a way to survive. In those very first hours, no one had understood the true scale of it. The earliest frantic reports guessed that perhaps a few hundred people had died. Then the number climbed to 1,000, and then to several thousand, and still it kept rising, as searchers pulled more and more of the dead from the ruins. The relief workers gathered lumber to begin rebuilding the shattered homes, and joined with a great New York newspaper to bring in donations from across the country, dollar by dollar, for a city that had lost almost everything. But the scale of the loss was almost impossible to grasp. Thousands were dead, thousands more were injured, homeless and starving. And the survivors now faced a terrible question that went far beyond the cleanup. Their city sat on a flat island, barely above the level of the sea, and the storm had just proven, in the cruelest way imaginable, that it could all be drowned again at any time. So should Galveston even be rebuilt at all? Should anyone live here, in the path of the next great storm? Many people simply left and never came back. And the city that had been the jewel of Texas, the richest port in the state, would never truly hold that place again. In the years that followed, the trade and the money and the future drifted to a safer city further inland, a place called Houston, which would grow into the giant we know today. Galveston settled quietly into the role of a smaller town beside the sea. And yet, the people who stayed did not surrender. They made a decision that would become one of the great feats of engineering in American history. They would not abandon their island to the sea. They would lift it out of reach. First, they built a great wall against the ocean. The Galveston Seawall, a curved barrier of solid concrete standing 17 feet high, was raised along the shore, its face shaped to throw the waves back on themselves. The first stretch alone was more than 3 miles long, and over the following decades it was extended again and again, until it ran for 10 miles along the coast. Then they did something that is almost impossible to believe. They lifted the entire city. Over several years, more than 2,000 buildings, homes, churches and shops were jacked up into the air on thousands of hand-turned screws, while sand dredged from the sea was pumped in beneath them to raise the very ground of the island higher. Some buildings were lifted as much as 17 feet. One brick church, weighing hundreds of tons, was raised on 700 jack screws. Inch by inch, the people of Galveston lifted their drowned city up above the reach of the water that had destroyed it. And when another major hurricane struck the island 15 years later, the seawall and the raised city held. Today, more than a century later, people walk along the Galveston seawall and look out at a calm and glittering gulf. And it is hard to believe that this same gentle sea once rose up in the dark and swallowed an entire city. But the memory is still there, just beneath the surface. Because the Great Storm of 1900 was more than a hurricane. It was the day an entire city learned how small a human being truly is against the power of the sea. A day that took thousands of lives in a single night. And a day that America has never been able to forget.